So here is the chart. Hopefully you have a copy of this chart. Have a few more left up here. But as we've been going through here, we're at this point here, the exile period. Here's the book of Esther right here. Here's Ezra, here's Nehemiah, here's the book of Esther. We've already talked about Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. We're not really talking about Malachi. He does the prophet later on. But the last prophet, of course, writing prophet, of course. So we're not going to deal with that. But I just want to give you a perspective here. Let's go to the next one here. You've had this handout as well. I try to emphasize that. Here's the book of Esther right here. I'm trying to show you here between Ezra chapters 1 through 6 and Ezra chapters 7 through 10, the book of Esther takes place in there. Keep in mind at this point here, in this book of Esther is taking place in another locality. It's not happening down in Israel. It's happening up in the Persian Empire, which is all part of the Persian Empire. Don't keep that in perspective, but it's happening in the palace of Shushan is where it's at. Known today as Susa, it's in Iran. So you have an idea, perspective where it's at. But Esther takes place here. As you see it, I know it's hard to read. I heard somebody say it's hard to read these things. So hopefully you got one in your hand, you can see it. But there's two names that you see there. And I probably won't say them exactly like it should be. One starts with the X, as you see there. Exodus, I may not say it right. That is the Greek name for him. Ahasuerus is the Hebrew name that we have in the book of Esther. So if you're in the book of Esther, you'll see Ahasuerus. You'll see his name there, okay? And he's the son of Darius the Great. So this is where we're going to concentrate in with the book of Esther, which is chapters 1 through 10, of course, through that book. So the background to this. The book of Esther describes events which took place in Susa, which is the principal Persian capital there, okay? And as you point out here, the actors are either Persians or Jews of the dispensation. That's who's involved in this story here. There's no mention is made of Palestine, Jerusalem, the temple. Any of those things are mentioned. Hebrew history, any of that's mentioned in here at all. But what's important, like it's already been pointed out, the Persian king is mentioned 190 times, but there's no mention of the Lord in here at all. So with that being the case, why is the book there? If it doesn't mention the names of the Lord, why is the book there? It's there because God wanted it there, I know, but most people's mindset would be, yes, brother?
God's providential care.
Providential care, and that's very important to keep that in focus. The Lord works in our lives. Sometimes it's like we don't know, we don't see all the things He does. I mean, He does things for us and takes care of us in so many ways. And that's what's happening here in this whole story. I hate to say the word story, and I want you to think it's a fairy tale. It's not. It's a true story. This whole event of whatever's taking place here in this book. But to see how God is working things. And Sister Irby said, things look bleak, look bad, but the Lord still works it around and makes it to happen for the good that takes place here. So I laid it out here. The plot is formed, the plot is fought, and the plot is foiled. Kind of give you a quick look at this whole book here. I tried to find an outline for it, and this is one I had to come up with using somebody else's thoughts. And I thought this is kind of condense it, make it as condensed as I could be for an outline to cover this. So as you see here, we're going to talk about the plot is formed. The plot that was formed. Anybody have any idea what the plot is? What's the key plot?
Get rid of the Jews.
What is it? Get rid of the Jews, okay? Get rid of them. Eliminate them completely, okay? So the plot is formed, chapters 1 through 3. And Esther will cover this part here. As you see here, it says, in the third year of his reign, Artaxerxes, if I can say his name right, he held a series of feasts. And the feasts last for 180 days. That's hard to fathom. But he has the largest empire at the time. He does what he wants to do. He has all his princes come there, and they have a big feast going on for 180 days. But then he has another separate feast for 7 days. And in that feast for 7 days here, if you want to turn to Esther chapter 1, we'll be covering this whole book, so we're covering a lot of territory here. If you look in here in verse 3, chapter 1, verse 3, in the third year of his reign, he made a feast unto all the princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces being before him. When he shewed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days, and when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present at Shushan the palace, both unto great and small, 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. Interesting how this palace is described here. It says, where were white, green, and blue hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rings of pillars of marble. The beds were of gold and silver upon a pavement of red, blue, and white and black marble. And they gave them drink in vessels of gold, the vessels being diverse one from another, and royal wine in abundance, according to the state of the king. And the drinking was according to the law. None did compel, but for so the king had appointed to all the officers of his house that they should do according to every man's pleasure. And Vashti, the queen, made a feast for the women in the royal house, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine. You think drinking affects you? It does affect you. He commanded Mehum, and I'm not going to list all these 7 chamberlains he's got here, that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the crown royal, to shew the people and the princess her beauty, for she was fair to look on. But the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned within him. Ticked him off, didn't it? Made him mad because she didn't come like he wanted her to come. She took a stand. So one of his closest friends here, his counselor, said, hey, why don't you do this? Why don't you have a beauty contest? But first you need to do this. The first thing you need to do, and then let's talk about the beauty contest. I jumped that. First you need to write a decree, and the decree is because why? Because if your wife won't obey you, and our wives won't obey, well, fine, hey, if she doesn't do it, then our wives won't obey us. These men, they say they're not going to obey us. So it comes down here, he says, we're in verse 16, Bimichan answered before the king and the princess, Vashti, the queen, had done wrong to the king only, but not only to the king, wrong to the king only, but also to all the princes and all the people that are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For this deed of the queen shall come abroad unto all women, so that they shall despise their husbands in their eyes. Then it shall be reported. The king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti, the queen, to be brought in before him, but she came not. The rumors are going to run. The story is going to go out to everybody, and they're going to know that the queen decided she was not going to come and obey the king. Likewise shall the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the king's princes, which have heard of the deed of the queen, thus shall there arise too much contempt and wrath. If it please the king, let him go a royal let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it be not altered, that Vashti come no more before the king of Ahasuerus, and let the king give her a royal estate unto another that is better than she. And when the king's decree which he shall make shall be published throughout all his empire, for it is great, all the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both to great and small. And the saying pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. And he sent letters into all the king's provinces, and into every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, that every man should bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language of every people. So it sends out this decree, and it goes out through the whole land. A little while later on, of course, Vashti is not the queen anymore, so now he has to have a queen. And as you see in chapter 2, in chapter 1, we talk about the refusal of Vashti, what happens there. So a letter set out across the... So in chapter 2, it's recommended he have a beauty contest. Find, this, as he sees here, it says, maidens were brought from all parts of the empire. I'm going to turn around and look at it myself. From the empire to provide a choice for the king. Among those was the Jewish orphan Esther, a descendant of Achish. who had been among the captives brought years before from Jerusalem. She had been brought up in the home of her cousin Mordecai, who held an office in the palace there. So that gives you a kind of a quick overview of Esther's background there. But she is also a Jew as well. Okay, keep that in mind. So as you see down here, let me move on to the next slide here because I got quite a few to cover. After a 12-month preparation, Esther was brought to the king Ahasuerus. If you look down here, excuse me. Let's go to verse 8. So it came to pass when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and many maidens were gathered together unto Shushan, the palace, to the custody of Hegai, that Esther was brought also unto the king's house to the custody of Hegai, keeper of the women. And the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him, and he speedily gave her for her purification, which such things belonged to her, and 7 maidens which were met to be given her out of the king's house, and he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not shew it. And Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her. So she's chosen, but there's a 12-month purification process that goes place. If you look down here in verse 15, that when the turn of, when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go in unto the king, she required nothing but what Hegai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. So Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus unto the house royal in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So she's chosen to be the next queen. She does not reveal who she is as far as being a Jew at all. Okay? So what's interesting down in verse 20, well, I think it's in the next verse, show up. There it is, moved over. Okay. Down here in verse 21. In those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, 2 of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth and sought to lay hands on the king Ahasuerus. And the thing was known to Mordecai, and he told it unto Esther, the queen, and Esther certified the king, therefore, of Mordecai's name. And when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out, therefore, they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. This little blurb here, this little piece of this information is going to play a key role later on in this whole story. If you haven't read the book of Esther, you'll see it play a very key later on. But it's interesting how this little small plot is a help later on that takes place. So Mordecai has found out about these assassins, and he reports it to Esther. She reports it to the king to do the inquiry, and they found out who the 2 guys were. Of course, they are hung, of course. So moving on. So in chapter 3. So about 5 years later, this is what Dr. Cloud says, about 5 years later, a guy named Haman is chosen to be like second in command in the kingdom. That's a high honor. That's a great level of where to be placed at, of course. And as you see here, I'm not going to read all that, but as you see here that he was the descendant of Agag. And what's important about that, he's a Amalekite. And the Amalekites and the Jews did not like each other. They were the arch enemies. They've always been arch enemies. But I read this and I kept thinking about where they located at. They're in Shushan, a palace, and where they were taken in captivity. So apparently Amalekites were taken up there too as well. It's the only thing I can figure out with him being up there. And yet he's put in a place of position. Mordecai is also in a place of position, but this Haman is put in this position here of a second in command for the empire. So keep that in mind there. Of course, with Haman's attitude was that everybody should bow down before him because the king said he's been promoted and everybody should bow down to him. Of course, one person doesn't want to bow down, and it's Mordecai. Now, as you see there, when Haman was exalted, the king commanded all the servants to bow before him, but Haman did not do so. Of course, a guy who's got a big ego, it really hurts their feelings, doesn't it? That takes place there. So in chapter, where are we at? Down chapter 3, moving down to chapter 3 there. And in verse 6, and he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had shewed him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. Finding out that he's a Jew, he wants to say, I'm going to get rid of all these Jews, because there's that constant hatred between the two of them, between the two Amalekites and the Jews here. I have my throat here. Move on. There, it moves on. I went too fast. Let me back this up for a second. So let me go through this part here. This is important to know here about this part here in chapter 3. In verse 8, and Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of the kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people. Neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore, it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have the charge of the business, to bring it into the king's treasury. And the king took his ring from his hand and gave it unto Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. Let me ask you a question. What did he tell the king? What did Haman tell the king? Did he tell him who the people were? He didn't identify them, did he? He didn't say what?
They didn't keep his law.
Yeah, but he said they didn't keep his law, but he didn't identify who are these people? Which people are you talking about? King never asked the question, who are you talking about? He never said, it's the Jews. Keep that in mind. He never asked that question, never was presented to him. The king was never presented to the king about who these people are. He just said, you got some people in your kingdom who do not obey your laws. Is that true? I see that deer in the headlight look.
They wouldn't bow down.
Well, they wouldn't bow down to him. But they were doing what? The first group of people in the book of Ezra, remember those group of people that went down to Jerusalem? There were so many that went down. I don't know where the numbers are that went down. Okay, they went down, but there were many of the Jews where? Still in captivity, still in Babylon, which is Babylon is part of the Persian Empire. They're still there, and they're still living there, and they're just prosperous. They're just staying there. So they're part of this empire up there. They're not like, there's no indication of being rebellious against the Persian Empire at all. They made themselves comfortable being there. They found a comfortable way to live while they're there. So keep that in mind. Haman is lying to the king just so he can get the king's permission to do what he wants to do. He doesn't tell the king, there's the Jews. These people, this select group of people are the ones who are against you. But they haven't done anything against him, okay? You got a guy named Mordecai who is part of the palace, also working there at the palace. He has nothing against the king at all. So that's just something to keep in mind. So with that, Haman is lying to the king, and he says, so the king, he says, okay, and the king is hey, in verse 10, and the king took his ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. And the king said unto Haman, the silver is given to thee, the people also to do with them as it seemeth good to thee. Then when the king's scribes called on the 13th day of the first month, and there was written according to all that Haman had commanded unto the king's lieutenants and to the governors, which were over every province, and to the rulers of every people of every province, according to the writing thereof, to every people, after their language, in the name of the king Ahasuerus was it written, and sealed with the king's ring. And the letters were sent by post unto all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, even upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. The copy of the writing for a commandment to be given in every province was published unto all people, that they should be ready against that day. Interesting, this letter goes out and it says, okay, on this particular day is when all this is going to take place. All this is going to take place in one day, to wipe out the Jews in one day. And he says in verse 15, and the post went out, being hastened by the king's commandment, and the decree was given to Shushan, the palace, and the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city Shushan was perplexed. They were perplexed. The people in the palace were perplexed about this demand, not realizing, and the king didn't know. Yeah, he gave permission, but not knowing who the permission was for to annihilate here. Okay? Of course, Mordecai gets, is perceived that what was done. And Mordecai rents his clothes and puts on sackcloth with ashes, it says there in chapter 4, verse 1, and went out of the midst of the city and cried with a loud and a bitter cry. Come on. Well, nothing wants to work this morning. My throat don't want to work right, and I sure can't get that to move. But it's not going to move. I don't know what's going to happen there. So this part here is that Mordecai, if you see here, he rents his clothes, puts on sackcloth and ashes, and he's upset, really. But in part of that, Esther finds out, hey, what is going on down there? What is happening down there? What is happening to Mordecai? So she sends one of her messengers down there to ask him, to find out what's going on. And so it says here in verse 4, so Esther's maids and her chamberlains come and told it her. Then was the queen exceedingly grieved, and she sent raiment to clothe Mordecai and to take away his sackcloth from him, but he received it not. Then called Esther for Hat, one of the king's chamberlains, whom he had appointed to attend unto her, and gave him a commandment to Mordecai to know what it was and why it was so. So this back and forth trying to find out. Mordecai finally tells her, if you look in I'm going to jump down there to verse 13. And verse 12, and they told Mordecai Esther's words, and Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not, this is what he told to tell Esther, think not that with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. Why is that? You're the queen, but do you think you're going to escape? Because you're also a Jew as well. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another part. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom of such a time as this? Then Esther bade them return to Mordecai this answer. That's a very interesting statement that you saw that Mordecai says to her. Who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? This just didn't happen just a couple of weeks ago. This has been a couple of years she's been in position, because I said earlier, when Haman took almost 5 years before her, Haman became second in command. Now this time has taken place over time. Now that queen is in this position, he's saying, who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? There's a purpose for this. There's a purpose for you being the queen through all this at this time. And he says here, and she responds back to him and says to Mordecai, go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maids will also fast likewise. So will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. Interesting that she would say that as a queen. She said, if I perish, I just perish. Why is that? Why would she say that? She's asked him to pray, not to pray, but to fast, because there's no mention of prayer here, to fast and not to eat for 3 days and all that. And they would also do that. Why does she make that statement about this?
No one was allowed to go before the king unless they were bid to come.
Correct.
She's just going to go in before him. She's going to take a chance with him. He just says,
Yeah, because you had to be invited by the king to be to come into his presence. But she's going to challenge that and do that, as you see in chapter 5 here, what takes place. But for her, she knows what the rules is. She knows the rule is that you just don't go in before. Even though she's married to the king, she's the queen, she just don't go in front of it. Just don't show up. Randy, can you make that thing move? I can't get it to do anything here. It's stuck. It's not responding at all. So in chapter 5 here, down to chapter 5, now I've got to move on faster than this. And it came to pass on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house over against the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house over against the gate of the house. And it was so, when the king saw Esther, what did he do? Yeah, go on again, Randy. Yeah, past that one. We're on chapter. See if it happens now. Yeah, there it is. Now it's moving. All right, thank you. There we are. Thank you. She's able to go there, and he allows her to come in. Because why? It's by God's hand, we know, but he's in love with her. He loves her very much, more than anybody, Because if you ever hear, we'll see this here in a moment, because when he says this, and then verse 3, then said the king unto her, what wilt thou, Queen Esther, and what is thy request? It shall be given thee to the half of the what? The kingdom. He'll give her half the kingdom if he wanted to, because he loved her so much, no matter what. Okay? Of course, she makes a request, and the request is that the king and Haman come to a banquet. So they come to a banquet. If you're going to find out here, they come to a banquet. And if you verse 7 down here, then answered Esther said, my petition and my request is, if I found favor in the sight of the king, and it pleased the king to grant my petition and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to a banquet that I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king has said. So with that in mind, Haman's excited, isn't he? He's excited. He's been invited by the queen to a banquet with who? The queen, the king, and him. So Haman's all excited. So he goes home and tells his family, as you see here in the next passage, then went Haman forth that day, joyful with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and he stood not up, nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman refrained himself, and when he came home, he sent and called for his friends and Zeresh, his wife. And Haman told them of the glory of the riches and of the multitude of his children and all the things wherein the king had promoted him, and how he advanced him above the princes and the servants of the king. Haman said, moreover, yea, Esther the queen did let no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she had prepared for but myself. And tomorrow I invited unto her also with the king. Yea, yet all this availeth me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the king's gate. Then says Zeresh his wife and his friends unto him, let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high tomorrow. Speak unto the king that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go thou in merrily with the king unto the banquet. That sounded good to Haman, didn't it? Let's build this gallows and let's get rid of this guy Mordecai and go in to see the king about it. They come to the, as you see in chapter 6, on the night, it says that night the king could not sleep. And he commanded the book of records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. In chapter 6, I'm going to skip over here, the gallows were built. Chapter 6, the king couldn't sleep. King couldn't sleep, so he asked for the Chronicles to be brought in to read the records. And he reads the records and finds out that someone saved his life. This guy named Mordecai had saved his life from this assassin. And he asked the question, the king did, I think it says there, Can't remember was what was done for him. Can't remember where was that. So it came, verse 6. So Haman came in. Oh, let's back it down there. Verse 4. And the king said, who is in the court? Back it up, verse 3. There is verse 3. And the king said, what honor and dignity have been done to Mordecai for this? Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, there is nothing done for him. We recorded all this, but nothing was done for Mordecai. So the king says, okay, we're going to do something about it. He says, who's in the court? Who's out there in the court right now? They said Haman is. So they bring Haman in, and it's interesting how the king presents this to Haman. Isn't it? Have you ever seen this part? In verse 6. So Haman came in, and the king said unto him, what shall be done unto him whom the king delighteth to honor? Can you see that guy's Haman's head just swell right up, man? This is it. I am going to get everything, you know. What else can the king do for me? And he says here, to honor. Now Haman thought in his heart, to whom would the king delight to do honor more than myself? And Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delighteth to honor, let the royal apparel be brought, which the king uses to wear, and the horse with the king that the king rideth upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head. And let this apparel and the horse be delivered to the hand of the one. And let's move on down through here, and it says, and let him be kind of walked down led through the whole group, and everybody just bow down. So the short of it is, he tells us elaborate things that should be done for this person. But it's interesting what the king says to him, as you see here. Then the king said to Haman, make haste and take the apparel and the horse, as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew. That sitteth on the king's gate, let nothing fail of that thou hast spoken. Oh, can you just see Haman's face just fall? Everything just fall down. He did this. He goes and does all this part. Moving through here. He's imagining for him being on the horse, him being led through being everybody honoring him, but it's not him. And he has to lead Haman with all this notoriety given to Haman. Given to Mordecai, given to him. Yeah.
See, God's timing is so perfect. Had Haman there at the right minute, and all this.
And it wasn't somebody else in the court. It was Haman having the. Haman was there for what? What purpose was he there for, anyways? Tim?
And of all the chronicles he could read, he read about Mordecai.
Interesting. Of all things that read, all the records they read that night. Of all times the king had insomnia, it was the same night. It was also the same time when Haman comes to do what? Request to hang Mordecai. All this coming together. Did it happen by accident? No way. It doesn't happen by accident. Okay? So moving on. I got to move on faster than this. So the short of it is, they have the chapter 7. Go down to chapter 7. So the king and Haman came to the banquet with Esther the queen, and the king said unto Esther, on the second day of the banquet of wine, what is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed, and even to the half of the kingdom. Again, he's willing to offer her half of the kingdom, no matter what. And she says, then Esther, the queen answered and said, if I have found favor in thy sight, O king, if it please the king, let my life be given at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. Then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, who is he and where is he that does presume in his heart to do so? Can you imagine that setting there with the king, Esther, and Haman? You can see Haman's even getting worse here. He's sweating it out, and she points to him. That's the guy right there. The adversary, the enemy of this wicked, in verse 6, Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. And the king, of course, you see, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden. So the king leaves the room, the place there, and so Haman is trying to plead for his life with Queen Esther, which doesn't look good, as you see here. So when the king returned in verse 8, returned out of the palace into the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed where Esther was. Then said the king, will he force the queen also before me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. And Habanoth, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai. He had spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him thereon. All of this you see coming together, taking place. Even though for Haman it's not coming together for him for good, of course, in any of this. So Haman is also hanged on the same gallows that he built for Mordecai. Down verse 8, I'm going to skip over verse 8, chapter 8 a lot. This is where all of Haman's possessions are given to Esther, and Esther gives it to Mordecai to give to him. But they also have to resolve something. What does they have to resolve? What is something they got to address here? The decree that cannot be reversed. It cannot be rescinded. It cannot be changed. The decree is still in effect to kill the Jews on a certain day. So with that, King Ahasuerus gives them permission, gives Mordecai the permission to write a counter to that. And he's allowed to do that and send it out. He's given the ring also, the signet ring is given to him to do so. So if you look down in chapter 8 and verse 10, and he wrote in the king Ahasuerus' name and sealed it with the king's ring and sent letters by post on horseback and riders and mules and camels and young dromedaries, wherein the king granted the Jews which were in every city to gather themselves together and to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to perish, and to cause to perish all the power of the people and province that would assault them, both little ones and women, and to the spoil of them for a prey. So they were given the chance, the Jews were given the chance also to protect themselves, to stand up against that. I'm kind of shortening this up a little bit here for you. So that decree is going out for them. We talked about that. We talked about that. Esther, pleads. Okay, he sends out the decree. So down in chapter 9 down there, so it says now in the 12th month, in the month Adar, remember that date that was given. That was the date that was given in the first decree. This is what's going to take place. Can you imagine that, knowing that you've been told, you know that months from now, there's going to be this vast war in a sense. There's going to be this slaughtering of trying to kill you off. And here they're given permission to fight, to stand against that. And it says that when the king's commandment and his decree drew near to be put in execution in the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it was turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated them. And the Jews gathered themselves together in their cities throughout all the provinces of the king of Ahasuerus to lay hand on such as sought their hurt. And no man could withstand them, for the fear of them fell upon all people. And all the rulers of the provinces and the lieutenants and the deputies and the officers of the king helped the Jews because the fear of the Mordecai fell upon them. I'm going to skip down here. And on the verse 12, and the king said unto Esther the queen, the Jews have slain and destroyed 500 men in Shushan, the palace, and 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request further? And it shall be done. Then said Esther, if it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews which are in Shushan to do tomorrow, also according to this day, decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows. And the king commanded, and it was so. And the decree was given to Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. The Jews survived through this. By all of this that took place, I got to get to the summary here because I want you to see the summary, why it's important to see this, the conclusion. So they were able to do this. They were able to survive through all of this, and how the Lord put all this together to make it work for them, to protect them through all of this. Of course, chapter 10 is going to talk about, I'm going to skip down in chapter 9, in verse 20, and Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters unto all the Jews that were in all the provinces of the kings of Ahasuerus, both nigh and far, to establish this among them, that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar and the 15th day of the month same yearly. As the days therein the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month which was turned unto them from sorrow to joy, from mourning into a good day, that they should make them days of fasting and joy, of sending portions of another and gifts to poor. The Feast of Purim was established by this. They do this every year now. They established this. This Feast of Purim was established for them back then. So I want to get to the conclusion for you. I thought this was an interesting conclusion. It's from Leon Book's book about the survey of Old Testament history. And I like the way he describes his points here. And that's why I wanted you to see there's just two parts to this part here. I know it's rather lengthy, but it kind of ties together everything you just saw that we went through quickly. God's special care was being extended toward those Jews in the east. These are the ones that were up there and where we were at, Shushan, the palace, and all that area up to there, okay? They had chosen not to return. I said that earlier. They had chosen not to return to their homeland when given opportunity. This care evidence, particularly in the precise time events for the Jews' benefit, is in fact the outstanding feature of this whole story. How it all comes together that you just saw here. These things. Esther became queen just in time to lead in thwarting Haman's plot. This guy Haman existed. He was going to be second in command, but then you see Queen Esther comes into place. Okay? Mordecai's attention was called in on a previous plot against the king, just in time to give the king reason to honor him at the most opportune moment. The king's experienced insomnia. The night that he experiences insomnia, of course, they bring into the records, and they read the records, and they talk about what Mordecai had done. We talked about that. The very night when Haman arrived to ask what? Asked to hang Mordecai. The result, and the king honored Mordecai in a manner most humiliating to Haman, just before Haman could make his own request to hang Mordecai. The crucial time sequence led to some remarkable reversals in expected happenings. The honor which the Jew-hating Haman believed was designed for him came to be for Mordecai. The gallows that Haman had made for Mordecai came to be used on Haman. And the edict that was signed by the Jew-hating Haman for doing away with all the Jews became instead the instrument for slaying Jew-haters generally, because there was another decree that went out for them to fight, to kill them. Interesting. Only God's special providence could account for such astonishing developments in this whole thing. Even though his name's not mentioned there, the Lord still took care of his people through all of this to save their lives, through all of this. This was a good quote here I found. It says, in Esther we see the wonderful interweaving of circumstances, which we get in this story, this history. There is a plot, there's an underplot. Wheels within wheels, circumstances hanging within circumstances, all formed together to work out the wonderful plans of God.
Amen.
It all worked together like God wanted to work out. So in our lives, when things say it doesn't look, looks dire and like it's bad, God's still in control. No matter what, he's still in control. I know that God's name is not even mentioned in this book, but this is still God's book that he had for us to see this and how he still works. I think it's interesting that we have this book, that we have a book without his name being in there, but he's still working through all of this. And that's something to keep in mind for ourselves. Keep in mind that God is still working in our lives. We might not, there's times when you think about, I was trying to think about when David, he's kind of down and out and doing some of the Psalms there and pleading for God, pleading, where are you, Lord? Think about Job, what Job went through. Job suffered a lot of stuff. Like, where are you, Lord? Even in our own lives, when things seem kind of bleak and all that, he's still there. He's still in control. No matter what the circumstances are around us, he's still in control with everything. And it all works out for good to what his plan is to be. It didn't work out for good to some people. The haters, they lost their lives. Haman lost his life. His family got impacted by what his stand, his hating of the Jews with all that.